Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff, starting a new unit. Wild stuff to talk about in this unit. So this unit, all right, is challenges to American ideals. So we've talked a lot about in this course throughout civic literacy, the different rights that are given to different people and how they fought to get those rights and how that moved forward through the legislative branch and the judicial branch and the executive branch. This unit, we're going to talk about some situations in which, we pass these laws. We have these ideals of how we expect people that are citizens of the United States or people in general that are inside our borders are to be treated. Well, that hasn't always been the case. There are quite a few situations in which our ideals of how we treat people have not been met. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit here in this unit, specifically with African Americans, how they've been treated throughout the course of American society, how that has changed over time, and how America has fallen short of meeting the ideals of how people are to be treated. We're also going to be talking about Native Americans, and there's a lot to unpack with that one. And also immigration, how immigrants, while founding the country, have also been treated very differently. Regardless of what the laws were, they were treated differently than what the American ideal is, how that came about, how we've dealt with that, and how we've moved forward up to present day and some of our existing challenges that we have today. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so starting the unit here on challenges to American ideals. We're going to talk about in this unit times in which certain Americans aren't treated equally with other Americans. The reason that's a big deal is because if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, which is going to lead to the Revolutionary War, and then our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Now, what's interesting about that is the guy who wrote all men are created equal was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. So what does that mean when he wrote all men are created equal? There is definitely some hypocrisy in American society. That's why not everything is cut and dried. So we're going to go through, starting here, and we're going to start with African Americans and their experiences through the American system, all right? Heavily up through the civil rights movement, and how that entire situation, entire group of people have not lived up to that ideal that all men are created equal and everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. So you can't just jump right into the civil rights movement and start talking about Martin Luther King Jr., a man most of y'all watching this have heard of. You got to kind of give some backstory here. Now, when you're talking about slavery in the United States, that in itself, you could pick a decade to make an entire college course out of it, of any time throughout slavery. So I wanted to kind of go through the basics here to clarify some things I think are very important to understand about slavery in the United States. All right. Some of this stuff, if you have a basic understanding of history, you're aware of. And I do think some of this will be new to you, and it'll be eye-opening. All right. So let me get to my pictures here. Originally, slaves are brought to the New World from Africa. They're African slaves in Africa. Sometimes they were free in Africa. Sometimes they were already slaves in Africa that were bought and sold into slavery and brought across with the Middle Passage into the New World. When slaves were brought over here, it was to fill this big need for labor. All right. African slaves were chosen as opposed to any other region in the world, mainly because African slaves were much more adept to the climate in the New World, especially since we'll talk a lot about America in the southern regions of the United States. They did not get sick the same way even white settlers did because they were more acclimated to the climate. Now, the slaves that are brought over are used for tobacco. They're used for indigo, rice. It wasn't just tobacco or one specific type. They were used for a lot of different crops. Now let me explain something very important here. Not all slavery is created equal. As crazy as that sounds, you're like, wait, are you getting ready to say there's good slavery? No. there is no good slavery, which is forced servitude. All right. However, the slavery, if you're grown up in America, your concept of slavery is probably the American version of slavery. So when you hear slavery, that's what pops in your mind. The American version of slavery is called chattel slavery. Chattel. Chattel slavery. That is the most extreme version of slavery. Slavery has existed for a really long time. Most societies at some point had some version of slavery in their society. If we go ancient times, we go Greece, Rome, prior, you can look at most religious texts, Bible, Quran, Old Testament, talk about slaves. Now, that's because slavery has existed a long time, but not chattel slavery. So what typically happens in slavery, more common than not, is somebody becomes a slave because of something they did in their life, whether they were a warrior and got beat by another army and they were forced to be a slave then. There are times people have sold themselves into slavery to pay off their own debt or the debt of other people. Sometimes it's a certain amount of time, sometimes it's permanent, all right? Slavery is forced servitude. The American version of slavery is wild. It's chattel slavery. Chattel slavery, even like other areas that had slavery, was like, that seems pretty crazy. Chattel slavery is where one human can own another human. Purchase it and be gifted another human. You own a person. Now that's common. Chattel slavery means that when the slave that this person owns that slave, when that slave has a child, that child is also a slave. That's not typical. Typically, if a slave has a child, that slave has a whole other person. That child isn't a slave. That child's free. That's how it works most other places that have slavery. So America's version of slavery is that if you purchase a human, their offspring you also own. That's crazy. So the slavery in the United States is different than the slavery that existed in a lot of other places previously around the world. It's chattel slavery, which is, again, the most extreme version of it. But chattel slavery was common over on this hemisphere, meaning the New World. So the Bahamas, Brazil, which we're going to talk about a little bit here in a minute. Chattel slavery is the common way of doing things because you had to have all this labor for farming and the different things that you wanted to do, so wealthy people would purchase humans and then own their offspring. Well, even among the slave-owning community, they realized this is pretty messed up. When it was time to create our Constitution, all right, if you notice, when we talked about the Constitution, very little was talked, if at all, about slavery. Even though Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, George Washington owned slaves, people owned slaves, and it wasn't like they forgot the fact they owned humans, but it was a touchy subject. So, the reason they don't talk about it is they kind of figured it wasn't worth talking about. It was probably going to be on its way out anyway. That was the belief, that slavery is naturally going to die off. Now, the reason they thought that, and they had some pretty good reasons for this, number one, the whole idea that you are bringing humans from one continent to another had already become very unpopular by the 1780s when we wrote our Constitution, right? When the Declaration of Independence was all men are created equal, right? All that stuff. It was already uncool to bring slaves from Africa to the New World because shortly after, in the grand scheme of things, the passing of the Declaration of Independence in the 1780s, 20 years later, the United States, on our own, right, the federal government decided, yeah, this whole bringing slaves from Africa, even that's too much for us. And really, without much fanfare, there is no more slaves can be brought in from Africa. All right? Now, that may not seem like a big deal because you're like, well, they have all these slaves here already. Like, we already have all these slaves. Like, that doesn't do anything. It is a big deal for this specific fact, and this is crazy. All right? And when I say it's crazy, this is an anomaly. This is odd. This is different than anywhere else. Chattel slavery, when you own for existence, all right, forever. Surprise, surprise, Slaves don't typically like that and do not thrive in that environment, knowing that their existence doesn't matter and their offspring's existence doesn't matter. So, every single area ever that has used chattel slavery, as soon as you stop bringing in more slaves, the slave population dwindles out because slaves die off faster than they reproduce in the chattel slavery system. It's just what happens. So when the United States in 1808 says, we're not bringing in any more slaves, it was the idea that, slaves are just going to naturally, because here's what happens. Brazil does it about the same. Once Brazil stops bringing in slaves, right, from Africa, they realize that their slave population is starting to dwindle. It's not a sustainable system. So a few years after they stopped bringing in slaves from Africa, they realized their population is going down anyway and it's not sustainable, so they just abolished slavery in Brazil. No more slavery in Brazil. All right? This is what happens everywhere on earth. As soon as you stop bringing in new slaves, the population starts declining, it's not sustainable, everybody moves away from it. Except in America. And historians, people do not understand why this is. There's no justification, there's nothing unique about it, but this is just a really weird situation that happens in America. And America's the only place this happened at. As soon as they stopped bringing in slaves from Africa in 1808, the slave population in America did not decrease. It maintained and actually grew. It's the only place on earth that when chattel slavery stopped bringing in new slaves, the slave population didn't go down. That's going to be a big deal because the reason Brazil went away from it is once they couldn't get new slaves and the population was naturally dwindling, it wasn't sustainable. In America, slavery is still sustainable. So this is all these people who said, let's not talk about it in the Constitution because it's going to go away anyway. It's not. And that is what's different about America. So all these people that own slaves, these plantation owners, are like, why go away from it? It still works. All right? So the question here is, while countries such as Brazil quickly abandoned slavery altogether after the end of the transatlantic slave trade, basically bringing them over from Africa, what odd anomaly happened in America that did not happen elsewhere, all right, that allowed slavery to continue to exist in America? So pause me, answer that, and we're going to move on. So to make matters worse in the concept of slavery, as the rest of the world is moving away from it, and America still has plenty of slaves to do something with, it almost looked like slavery was going to end naturally anyway, because new advancements in technology, growing tobacco, rice, indigo, these other crops weren't as necessary to have this massive amount of population. As people get more advanced, it takes less people to do the same amount of work. Then this dude, Eli Whitney, comes out and he makes an invention called the cotton gin. Now, back in the day, in the 1800s, people knew how to grow cotton. That wasn't the issue. The problem was that everybody wore clothes. They still did. Basically, you either had to go like shirtless or you wore wool, which is sheep's hair. All right. And those were your options. Well, if you live in hot environments, all right, it's pretty awful to have to wear wool. People would love to have cotton. Silk was crazy expensive from China. People wanted cotton. The problem is, cotton was very hard to come by and incredibly expensive. The reason cotton is incredibly expensive is because harvesting cotton is very difficult. The reason is, if you've ever seen cotton, it grows about thigh high, all right, and it blooms, and it's got a little cotton ball on top and some on the sides. And if you can't just go pick that cotton ball. I mean, you can, but inside that cotton ball is a seed, and that seed is really, really, really hard to get out. So if you grew cotton, growing the cotton's not the hard part. It's getting the seed out of it that's really, really difficult. All right, so it's very labor intensive, and I mean it's going to take you hours and hours and hours to get enough cotton for like one t-shirt, and your hands are going to hurt getting that seed out. Well, Eli Whitney invents a little box. All right, the box is called the cotton gin, and all it does is you take a whole bunch of cotton balls that have the seed in it, you put it in this box, you close the top, those claws hold it in place, you crank the little lever on the side, and it rips all the cotton off the seed. Now the hardest part of growing cotton, de-seeding it, is now the easiest part. Well, farmers, all right, a lot of farmers in the United States, especially anything really from like South Carolina down to Texas, realize there's money to be had in cotton because everybody around the world wants cotton. Well, here's what you need to grow cotton. You need a warm climate and a bunch of land. The New World, America, new country, tons of land in warm areas in the south part of the United States. All right? They also already have labor to do it, slaves. So a lot of people that were growing rice or indigo or tobacco start switching over to cotton. The reason that's important, all right, is because when you grow tobacco, there's only a certain amount of tobacco you can grow because, well, you have to get it out of fields before it rots, all right? So you might grow 75 acres of tobacco. When you got your 75 acres of tobacco, or your dad or granddad or whatever, and you decide to buy slaves for that, you bought enough slaves to work on 75 acres of tobacco. Well, slave trade ends, then they switch over to cotton. You need a lot more land to grow cotton. Cotton doesn't rot in the fields, so you can take more time to harvest it. Because of that, all right, that same plantation owner that has 75 acres, and he might have, I'm just going to make up some numbers, I have no idea what the slave to ratio acreage is. We'll say you have 25 slaves work 75 acres, all right? If you go grow cotton, you're now going to grow 300 acres, all right? Because why not? You can buy the extra land, it's wide open spaces. The reason they didn't do that for tobacco is because by the time you harvested it, it would rot and die. You couldn't get out there fast enough. It's not an issue with cotton. It'll stay bloomed until you get to it. You know how many slaves you got? 25. That now have to do 4 or 5 times the amount of work. All right? Ain't nobody in their right mind willing to get hired for that job. All right? Because that's crazy. That's crazy work. Nobody else is willing to work in the cotton fields. So slaves are the ones that are forced to do it. There's no other options if the slaves won't do it. Because of that, the value of the slaves in the United States skyrockets, and the South is going to clamp down on the institution of slavery and refuse to let it go because their entire economy, King Cotton, because the South is the #1 exporter of cotton, like almost instantly, around the entire world. And they make their money from growing cotton off the backs of slaves. If the slaves aren't there, there's nobody willing to do that level of brutal work. So the South digs in and refuses to let the slaves leave, or refuse to even listen to this idea that we might go away from slavery because it would be in their entire livelihood. All right. So the question here is how did the invention of the cotton gin cause America to cling to the institution of slavery even more? So we kind of talked about that there in detail. So kind of synthesize all that, answer that question completely. Pause me if you need to. And we're moving on. So, spoiler alert, this ain't cool. A lot of people, especially in the North, right, which is blue here, all right, the northern part of the United States, they didn't have slaves anymore because they're not growing cotton. Now they are buying all the cotton from the South, knowing it is grown by slaves. So there's hypocrisy all around. All right. Well, by the 1850s, there's this huge movement over how immoral slavery is, and the North, the area here in the blue, the United States of America, has a big issue with slavery in the South, specifically over its spreading. We'll talk a lot more about that in U.S. history. We'll go into the details of that. But what you need to know is that there is a civil war that's going to happen from 1861 to 1865 over the institution of slavery. Sure, they're arguing over the South says it is the state's rights to not have to, listen to the federal government. The federal government's like, no, the federal government can supersede the state's rights. You know what they're arguing about? What you have the right to do? Own slaves. Without slavery, the Civil War does not happen. All right, but so the country splits in half. All right. The United States of America, which is the North, versus the Confederate States of America, and a huge civil war takes place between the Confederate States of America and the United States. 620,000, actually that number has here recently, scholars believe it's closer to like 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Tons of stories there. What you need to know is that the United States of America, the North, is going to win, and the South, led by Robert E. Lee, who is the head general, will surrender the Ulysses S. Grant. A whole bunch of little side stories there. And the North wins the Civil War. Well, at the very end of the Civil War, realizing the whole issue was over slavery, Abraham Lincoln, who's the president at the time, writes and has passed the 13th Amendment, which says slavery in the United States is over. There is no more slavery in the United States, right? It has ended. So the 13th Amendment officially ends slavery. Well, everything's over then. Let's go home. Nope. This is where it starts getting disappointing. As an American looking back on this in history, it's pretty bad. So the best way of describing this, when slavery existed, America, especially in the South, is pretty much on a class system. You have your rich people, you have your poor people, you got your slaves. You're one of those three classes, all right? So almost all your poor people were white. There were freed slaves, all right? That would be poor, but it was always a class system. Rich people, poor people, slaves. Once slavery gets wiped out, all right, then they're all poor people. So the poor whites in the South feel like since the freed slaves or they're on equal footing, however you want to look at it, that they have been demoted in society. And there is a huge backlash to the freed slaves. While it used to be a class system of you're a slave, so therefore you're inferior, the human mind knows no bounds when it comes to trying to attempt discrimination. It just turns into, well, I don't like you now because of the color of your skin, because you're an African American, because you're black. That's why I don't like you. That becomes, and you see massive racism. Not that slavery wasn't, partially influenced by racism. After the 13th Amendment, it is widespread racism. There's no justification of why you don't like somebody other than just the color of their skin. So much so the South, right? And there's a lot of states in the South where, like Mississippi, there are literally more black people in Mississippi at the time than there are white people. Even the freed slaves, right? So they are the majority in a lot of places in the South. White people in the South, right, not wanting to lose control of society, immediately turn around and make separate rules for the freed slaves. The first thing that happens in the South is this thing called the Black Code. The Black Code is literally a set of laws for black people, for freed slaves, right? Even if you were a wealthy freed slave or a wealthy black person before, which did exist, it was very rare, they are now lumped in with everybody else. So we've gone to a racial system now of ranking people, which it just seems crazy. But, so the Black Code is a set of laws created by the white governments, because white people still ran all the state governments, which put a whole separate set of laws on black people. Like vagrancy laws, curfews for black people. If they're not in the house, if they're not home by 9 p.m., they can be arrested. When they go to jail, the jail can then rent out rent out that black person that was imprisoned to a farmer to work in his cotton field. Because that's a prisoner. Gee, that seems a whole lot like slavery. It pretty much was. The Black Code immediately came out to officially say black people are second-class citizens. They are not equal to everybody else. All right? Well, the United States government up north, they see this like, dude, not cool. Now, I want to clarify real early on. The North is not some glorious beacon of hope that views African Americans as equal. By comparison, they tend to be much better, but they don't think that it is fair to treat black people under the Constitution as second-class citizens. So while there's still massive racism up north, this level of making separate laws based on the color of your skin is crazy. Also, random side note, because I get this question all the time in class. What if you're mixed, Mr. Wagstaff? What happens if you're just really light, if you're mixed? Because society is so verifiably ranked on class systems, it was very rare. I mean, just almost like, but what if it would be on a person-by-person basis? It was almost a non-existent thing to have mixed people at the time that were white and black. Very, very rare. So the United States government, completely unhappy, and says it's completely uncool that you have a whole set of laws on black people that is different than a whole set of laws that is different for black people than it is for the rest of the population is completely unacceptable. All right. So to combat the black codes, which is stuff like you can't own property, you can't own guns, right? Completely saying you don't have your Second Amendment rights, you can't vote, not allowed to vote. That's part of the black code. Can't vote. If you didn't have a job or you're out past curfew, you can be arrested and forced to work for no pay. The United States government's like, yeah, we're not going to let that fly. So the United States government, shortly after the Civil War, and this lasts about a year, they're going to pass the 14th Amendment, which we had talked about earlier. Now I think maybe you have some concept of how significant this is. The 14th Amendment says, whoa, not a thing. All citizens are equal. You can't have a set of laws for this set of citizens and not this set of citizens. Laws have to be equal for everybody. All right. They're also going to pass the 15th Amendment, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next election. In the next lesson, which gives freed black men the right to vote. All right. And we're going to talk about that in the next lesson. But the 14th Amendment says everybody has to be treated under the law. All right. So the black codes are illegal. Black codes are laws that just apply to black people. Those are now illegal. You have to throw all those out. Well, looks like we solved that one. We're done, right? No, we're not. Because what immediately happens in the South is these laws that get passed, right? And they're called Jim Crow laws, right? I really tried to find a really cool story to explain to you why Jim Crow laws is called that. There's not. So, FYI, otherwise I would tell it to you. These Jim Crow laws, all right, they're racist laws, but they apply to everybody equally. So technically, these laws apply to everybody. This is where we get the very first segregation. Black people have to stay over here. White people stay over here, all right? Technically, the law applies to both sides. However, when you divide everything in half, guess who's going to get the nicer of the half? It's white people. Who's going to get the not nice part? This is black people. That's just how it was. We will explain in detail why it ends up being that way. Even though the law is equal, it is still designed to be discriminatory towards black people, and we're going to talk about in future lessons exactly why that is. But the black codes, because of the 14th Amendment, get thrown out. That's illegal. You can't have a separate set of laws just for one race and not the other. So then the South starts making Jim Crow laws, which aggressively segregates society. All right. So Jim Crow laws technically apply to everybody, white people and black people, but it is still designed to give white people an advantage. And these almost exclusively existed in the South. So the question here is explain the difference between the black code and the Jim Crow laws. This is where, so answer that completely. This is where we're going to stop at today. We're going to go through. I got a handful of more lessons on the civil rights movement and the failures of America to live up to our own ideals, specifically with African Americans. And then in future lessons, we'll talk about immigration, experiences of immigrants, as well as experiences of Native Americans in this unit. So, answer that, pause me, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.